the whalebone stays of the corset dug into Emma Sullivan's ribs with the unyielding insistence of a promise she had never made. Each breath was a negotiation, a shallow victory against the strictures of silk and bone that bound her. From her place beside William Hartley at the head of the long, linen-draped table, the great hall of his new ranch house seemed to shimmer and warp under the glow of 100 candles. The light caught the crystal glasses and the polished silver, making the whole scene look like a dream, someone else's dream, bought and paid for. At 22, Emma had known the West as a place of raw, punishing beauty. She knew the smell of dust kicked up by the herd, the feel of sun-baked leather reins in her hands, and the vast, soul-stretching silence of the prairie at dawn. That was her world. This cage of suffocating perfume, polite laughter, and the ceaseless, proprietary pressure of William Hartley's hand on the small of her back was a foreign country. Hartley was 52, a man carved from the same hard rock as the mountains that shadowed Cedar Ridge. He had built an empire of cattle and land, his influence stretching across the territory like the long afternoon shadows. His first wife had passed a decade ago, leaving him with a fortune and an echoing house. Now, he had acquired a new fixture for it. He looked at Emma not with the tenderness of a groom, but with the quiet satisfaction of a man admiring a prize stallion he had just purchased at auction. His gaze swept over her white satin gown, the pearls at her throat, the diamond ring that felt heavier than a blacksmith's hammer on her finger. He was assessing his investment. "A bit pale, my dear," he murmured. His voice a low rumble meant only for her. "You must be overwrought. It is a great day." Emma managed a smile that felt like cracking porcelain. A great day for whom? For her father, whose failing ranch was now secured by this union. For her mother, who saw this marriage as the pinnacle of a woman's achievement, a final, triumphant ascent into security and status. They sat across from them, her father looking relieved and slightly drunk, her mother beaming with a brittle pride that didn't quite reach her eyes. They loved her. Emma knew, in their own way, but their love was a practical, fearful thing, shaped by drought and debt. They saw Hartley not as a man 3 decades her senior with cold, assessing eyes, but as a fortress against the unforgiving hardships of their world. They had locked their only daughter inside for her own safety. Her own dreams felt like childish things now, wisps of smoke in the face of this solid, unchangeable reality. She had imagined a small schoolhouse of her own, the eager faces of children learning their letters. She had pictured a life built with a partner, a love that grew slow and steady like a cottonwood by a creek, not one that was signed and sealed like a land deed. All those quiet hopes had been packed away, buried beneath the weight of filial duty. She was a good daughter. She had always been a good daughter. The thought was a comfort and a curse, the very bars of her gilded cage. Sheriff Morrison, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun and worry, raised his glass from a few seats down the table. He offered a tight, official smile. He was the law in Cedar Ridge, but everyone knew William Hartley's word was the truer power. Morrison upheld the law, but Hartley wrote it, in unspoken agreements and financial arrangements that kept the town in his pocket. The sheriff's presence was a formality, another seal of approval on the transaction. The music from the corner of the hall swelled, a lively fiddle tune that felt like a mockery of the stillness in Emma's heart. Couples began to take to the polished floor, their boots scuffing out a rhythm of celebration. Hartley stood, pulling Emma to her feet with a firm hand. "They expect a dance from the bride and groom," he said, his tone leaving no room for refusal. He led her into the swirl of bodies. His hand was a brand on her waist, his steps sure and proprietary. He moved her through the dance with the same effortless control he managed his cattle empire. Emma felt like a puppet, her limbs responding to his lead while her mind drifted away, out past the candlelit windows, into the vast, dark expanse of the plains. It was out there, 2 months ago, that she had done the one thing in her life that was truly her own, an act of simple instinct that belonged to no one else. She'd been riding in the foothills, searching for a stray calf, when she found him, a young Apache boy, no older than 15, his leg caught and broken in a rock slide. He had looked at her with the fierce, terrified eyes of a cornered hawk, his hand on the hilt of a knife. The people in Cedar Ridge spoke of the Apache with fear and hatred, tales of raids and violence their only currency. But Emma had seen only a boy in agony. Ignoring the fear that pricked at her skin, she had dismounted. She offered him water from her canteen, speaking in the calm, soothing tones she used with a spooked horse. Slowly, carefully. She used her own knife to cut away the leather of his leggings and splinted his broken leg with branches and strips torn from her petticoat. She had given him the rest of her water and the small parcel of bread and jerky from her saddlebag. He never spoke a word, but as she prepared to leave, his eyes had met hers, and in their dark depths was an acknowledgement that passed beyond language, a silent recognition of a debt she had never told a soul, knowing it would be twisted into something ugly and dangerous. It was her secret, the last thing that was wholly hers. The fiddle music screeched to a halt, mid-note. A sudden, sharp silence fell over the hall, a void so abrupt that the dancers stumbled to a stop, turning toward the great oak doors. The festive chatter died in 100 throats. The doors hadn't been opened. They had been pushed, wide and commanding, from the outside. Framed in the dark rectangle of the night stood a dozen men. They were not townsfolk. Their skin was the color of the red earth, their hair long and black. They were armed not with pistols in holsters, but with rifles held with a quiet, unnerving ease. They were Apache, and at their head stood a man who carried himself with the stillness of the mountain peaks. He was tall and lean, his face a mask of hard plains and shadows, but his eyes, fixed and intense, swept the room until they found her. Panic erupted. Women screamed. Men scrambled for weapons that weren't there, their coats hanging on pegs by the door. William Hartley's face went from ruddy satisfaction to a mask of purple fury. "What is the meaning of this?" he boomed, stepping in front of Emma as if to shield his property. "Sheriff, do your duty." Sheriff Morrison was already on his feet, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt, his expression grim. "This is a private celebration. State your business and be on your way." The leader of the Apache party took a step into the room, his moccasins silent on the polished floor. His gaze never left Emma. "We have no business with the lawmen, or with this loud house. Our business is a matter of honor." He spoke English with a low, clear precision that cut through the fearful whispers. "We have come for the one you call Emma Sullivan." A collective gasp went through the room. Hartley's hand shot out, grabbing Emma's arm in a bruising grip. "You will do no such thing. She is my wife. This is my home." "She is your wife by a law of paper," the man replied, his voice calm and level. "She is an honored benefactor by a law that is much older. 2 moons ago, she gave life back to my brother when the mountains would have claimed him. Our law says such a debt cannot be ignored. We have come to offer her our protection." Emma's heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird beating against the cage of her corset. Her secret was out, and it had walked into her wedding reception on silent feet, armed with rifles. She saw her father's face, pale with terror, and her mother, who looked as if she might faint. "Protection," Hartley scoffed, his voice dripping with contempt. "From what? From her husband? From her own wedding feast? This is insanity. Get out of my house before I have you all shot." The Apache leader, Naichi, as Emma would later learn he was called, ignored him completely. His focus was a tangible thing, a line drawn directly from his eyes to hers, pulling her out of the noise and the fear. He saw her. Not the bride, not the property, not the daughter, but the woman trapped inside the white satin dress. "He calls this protection," Naichi said, his voice soft but carrying across the silent room. He puts you in a cage of fine cloth and calls it a home. He puts a ring on your finger and calls it devotion. We see the truth. We see the bars. We have come to honor the one who saved Tazu. My brother. He gestured with his chin to a younger man at his side, who met Emma's gaze with the same silent acknowledgement she remembered from the foothills. The room was a powder keg. Hartley's men were beginning to move, their faces hard and grim. The sheriff was caught in an impossible position, outnumbered and standing between two worlds, two laws that were about to collide in blood and fire. But Naichi did not seem to see the impending violence. He saw only her. He took another step forward, holding out a hand. It was a strong hand, calloused and capable, an invitation. "They will not harm you while we are here," he said to her, "but we cannot stay forever. The choice is yours. Stay, and you will wither. Your breath will grow thin. Your spirit will be tamed. Come with me, and you can still breathe. The air is sharp in the mountains, but it is free." "Stay! Go!" The words echoed in the sudden, roaring silence of Emma's mind. She looked at William Hartley's face, twisted with rage and a sense of violated ownership. This would be her life, his anger, his control, his suffocating possession. She looked at her parents, their faces pleading with her to be sensible, to be safe, to be the good daughter they had raised. And then she looked at Naichi's outstretched hand, at the open door behind him that led into the cool, dark promise of the night. It was not a choice between safety and danger. It was a choice between two kinds of death, a slow, comfortable one in a gilded cage, or a fast, uncertain one in the wild. But the wild was the only place she had ever felt truly alive. In that instant, the quiet, obedient part of her, the part that had endured the fittings for the dress and the endless discussions of the wedding arrangements, the part that had accepted the heavy diamond ring, simply died. Something new and fierce and desperate took its place. She pulled her arm from Hartley's grasp. He was so stunned by her defiance that his grip loosened for a fraction of a second. But it was enough. She took a step, then another, moving away from the head table, away from her groom, away from the life that had been laid out for her like a shroud. A cry of outrage came from Hartley. Her mother sobbed her name, but Emma didn't stop. She walked across the polished floor, the swish of her satin gown the only sound in the spellbound room. She walked toward the dark man with the steady eyes, toward the open door. She put her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and firm. Chaos erupted behind her. Shouts, the crash of an overturned table. Naichi pulled her toward the door, another of his men stepping to her other side. As they reached the threshold, the long, elaborate train of her gown snagged on a splintered floorboard. She was anchored to the life she was trying to flee. Without a word, the Apache beside her drew a long knife, and with a single, sharp rasp of steel on silk, he sliced through the expensive fabric. The heavy train fell away, leaving her in a shortened, ragged version of her wedding dress. She was free. Naichi lifted her onto the back of a waiting pinto, swinging up behind her. She wrapped her arms around his waist as the horse surged forward, melting into the night with the others. The warm, frantic pulse of the animal beneath her was a stark contrast to the cold, dead weight of the ring on her finger. Glancing back, Emma saw the rectangle of bright, chaotic light that was the doorway to her old life. Figures were spilling out, shouting into the darkness. But the night swallowed the sounds, just as it was swallowing her. The wind tore at her hair, whipping away the carefully placed pins, unraveling the veil. It felt like a baptism, washing away the perfume and the lies, leaving only the cold, sharp, terrifying scent of freedom. She was a bride on a stolen horse, riding away from her own wedding in half a dress, a fugitive from a life she had not chosen, heading into a darkness that felt more like dawn. The world behind them dissolved into a memory of frantic light and muffled shouts. Ahead, There was only the immense, breathing darkness of the prairie and the rhythmic drumming of hooves on hard-packed earth. Emma clung to Naichi, her cheek pressed against the unfamiliar texture of his leather tunic. The motion of the horse was a powerful, living thing beneath her, a world away from the genteel side saddle gaits she was used to. This was flight, raw and desperate. Every jolt sent a fresh stab of pain from the corset. Its whalebone stays a rigid reminder of the life she had just shattered. The ragged hem of her satin dress whipped in the wind, already snagging on brush and collecting the dust of their passage. She was a ridiculous figure, a ghost of a bride haunting the midnight plains, and the absurdity of it all might have made her laugh if she'd had any breath to spare. Fear was a cold stone in her stomach, but laced through it was a thread of wild, terrifying exhilaration. For the first time in her life, she was riding into a future that was utterly her own, a blank page in a book she hadn't even known existed. They rode hard for what felt like hours, a silent, disciplined column of shadows moving across the land. Naichi said nothing, his body a solid, reassuring presence in front of her. He rode with an innate grace, a part of the horse, a part of the night. Occasionally, he would make a low sound, a signal to the others, and their course would shift, veering toward a line of low hills that rose like a jagged spine against the star-dusted sky. As they drew closer, the ground grew rougher, the open plains giving way to a broken landscape of rock and ravine. Naichi slowed his horse to a walk, and the others followed suit, their mounts picking their way carefully through the treacherous terrain. He pointed toward a narrow slit in the rock face, a fissure so dark it seemed to have swallowed the starlight. "The devil's backbone," he said, his voice the first sound to pass between them in a long time. It was low and calm. "We go through. It is slow, but it is safe. Their horses are not trained for these paths in the dark." The entrance was barely wide enough for a single horse. The air grew instantly colder as they passed into the canyon, the sheer rock walls rising on either side, blotting out the sky until only a thin ribbon of stars was visible far above. The sound of their horses' hooves echoed strangely, a hollow, lonely noise in the deep silence. The path was a narrow ledge, falling away into unseen depths on one side. Emma squeezed her eyes shut, fighting a wave of vertigo. She forced herself to breathe, to trust the steady horse, to trust the man who guided it. After another hour of tense, painstaking progress, Naichi called a halt in a small, sheltered alcove where the path widened slightly. The men dismounted with a quiet efficiency that spoke of long practice. Naichi slid from the horse and then turned, reaching up for her. For a moment, she hesitated. His hands were there, waiting. She placed her own in them, and he swung her to the ground as if she weighed nothing. Her legs, unused to straddling a horse, trembled and almost gave way. He steadied her with a hand on her arm, releasing her the moment she found her balance. There was no familiarity in the touch, only a kind of impersonal courtesy. Tazu, the young man she had saved, approached her, his face solemn in the gloom. He held out a water skin. "You should drink," he said softly. Emma's throat was a desert. She took the skin, her hands fumbling with the stopper. The water was cool and tasted of stone and earth. It was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. She drank deeply, the simple act of quenching her thirst a profound, grounding pleasure. She was alive. She was thirsty. She was drinking. The complex, suffocating rules of her old life seemed a universe away. But the corset was still there, a cruel warden. Every deep breath was a battle. She could feel the skin on her ribs chafing, raw and angry. The fine satin of her dress was now stained and torn, a useless, cumbersome garment. It was a costume for a play that had ended abruptly. Naichi was watching her, his expression unreadable in the faint light. He saw her labored breathing, the way she unconsciously tugged at the neckline of her gown. He turned and spoke to Tazoo in their own tongue, a series of low, guttural sounds. The young man nodded and moved away, returning a moment later with a knife. He offered it to Naichi, who in turn held it out to Emma. Hilt first. "Your dress is not made for these mountains," he said simply, "and that cage you wear beneath it will kill you faster than a fall." Emma stared at the knife. It was a practical tool, its blade honed and purposeful. It was an offer, not a command. The choice, once again, was hers. All her life, she had been dressed and styled by others, molded into a shape that was pleasing and proper. Taking this knife, cutting away the finery, felt like a transgression far greater than leaving her own wedding. It was an act of unmaking. Her hand was surprisingly steady as she took it. The horn handle was smooth and cool. She turned away from the men, seeking the privacy of a deeper shadow against the rock wall. The shredded remains of her train were easy enough to deal with, and she sawed at the satin skirt until it was a ragged hemline just below her knees. The fabric fell away at her feet, a puddle of white in the darkness, like a shed skin. She felt lighter already. The corset was a more formidable enemy. She couldn't reach the laces down her back. Frustration and a hint of panic pricked at her. She hacked at the side seams, the knife slipping against the slick fabric. Finally, she managed to cut through the laces, sawing through the tough cords. With a final, desperate pull, the corset sprang open. She gasped, sucking in a deep, full, painful breath of the cold night air. It was the first real breath she had taken all day. It filled her lungs to their very bottom, a shocking, dizzying rush of oxygen. She leaned against the rock wall, her head swimming, as she tore the hated garment from her body. Casting it aside, it landed with a soft thud, a discarded piece of armor from a forgotten war. When she stepped back toward the others, she felt exposed, vulnerable, but also immensely, powerfully free. She was standing in the heart of a wilderness, in a torn dress and thin chemise, but she could breathe. The simple, profound reality of it was staggering. Naichi gave a slight nod, a flicker of approval in his eyes. He took a piece of dried meat from a pouch at his belt and handed it to her. It was tough and salty, and she chewed it slowly, the primitive need for sustenance overriding any sense of decorum. This was survival. All the useless things had been stripped away. They rested for a short time, just long enough for the horses to breathe. The men were preparing to move out again when a scout, who had seemingly materialized from the rocks above them, slid silently into their midst. He spoke rapid, low words to Naichi. A new tension filled the small space. Naichi looked back down the canyon, in the direction they had come. "Hartley's men," he said to Emma, his voice flat. "They have not given up. They have torches. They are at the mouth of the canyon. But they have stopped. They are afraid of the dark path." Emma's blood ran cold. The image of William's enraged face swam before her eyes. He would not see this as a rescue. He would see it as a theft. He would hunt her down. Not because he loved her, but because she was his, a piece of property that had been stolen. The thought filled her with a new and different kind of fear, one that was colder and sharper than her fear of the heights or the darkness. "Will they follow?" she asked, her voice a thin whisper. "Perhaps when the sun comes," Naichi said. "We must be far from here by then." He looked at her again, at the thin fabric of her chemise and the inadequate dress. The night was growing colder, a deep, penetrating chill that seeped from the rocks. She was shivering, though she tried to hide it. This time it was Tazoo who came forward. He carried a bundle of soft, tanned deerskin. He laid it gently at her feet. It was a simple tunic and leggings, stitched with practical skill. Clothes meant for moving, for living, for surviving in this raw country. "You will be cold," Tazoo said, his English more hesitant than his brother's. He looked at her with a profound, almost solemn gratitude. "This is a small thing, for a great gift." Emma stared down at the deerskin clothes. This was a line she had not anticipated crossing. To shed the dress was one thing. It was a symbol of a wedding she had rejected. But to don the clothing of the Apache felt like a step into another world entirely, a step away from everything she had ever been. It was an acceptance, an alignment. In the eyes of the men who were hunting her, it would be the ultimate betrayal, proof that she was not a victim, but a willing participant. It would make her one of them. She looked from the clothes on the ground to Naichi's impassive face. He was not compelling her. He was simply waiting, allowing her the dignity of her own decision. In his stillness, in his quiet respect for her autonomy, he offered her more regard than William Hartley had in all the weeks of their courtship. Hartley had wanted to own her. Naichi, it seemed, only wanted her to survive. Her duty to her parents, her place in her community, her very identity as Emma Sullivan of Cedar Ridge, all of it felt distant, like a story about someone else. That person would freeze to death on this mountain. That person would be dragged back to William Hartley and put back in her cage. Slowly, she bent and picked up the deerskin tunic. It was softer than she could have imagined, and smelled faintly of wood smoke and sage. It was the scent of the wild, of the world she had chosen in one desperate leap of faith. She clutched the soft leather to her chest. Her decision made. She would not freeze. She would not be dragged back. She would survive. She would go forward. She would cross the line. The dawn that broke after their passage through the Devil's Backbone was not a gentle affair. It was a stark, brutal affair. The sun cracking over the eastern peaks and spilling a harsh, unforgiving light across a landscape of stone and scrub. Emma, dressed in the soft deerskin, felt as though she had been remade during the night. The stiff, corseted woman who had walked into William Hartley's wedding hall was gone, scraped away by rock and fear and the simple, profound act of breathing freely. They rode for another half-day, moving into a labyrinth of canyons that seemed to fold in on themselves, a land designed to hide its secrets. Emma had ceased to be a passenger and was now a rider. Naichi had given her the reins of her own mount, a steady, sure-footed mare. He rode beside her, a silent instructor, pointing with his chin to show her how to read the terrain, how to shift her weight for a steep descent, how to trust the animal beneath her. The fear had not vanished, but it had settled, changing from a sharp panic into a low, constant hum of awareness. It made her senses keen, made the world feel intensely, painfully real. Just when she thought her body could not endure another hour in the saddle, Naichi held up a hand, bringing the column to a halt. He gestured toward a wall of rock that looked no different from any other they had passed. But as she watched, he guided his horse toward a dense thicket of brush growing at its base. Behind it was a fissure, an opening almost completely concealed. One by one, they slipped through the gap, and the world changed. The air grew cooler, softer, filled with the scent of damp earth and cottonwood trees. The sound of running water, a gentle, constant murmur, reached her ears. They had entered a hidden valley, a slash of impossible green tucked into the heart of the Red Rock Desert. A clear stream snaked through a meadow dotted with the beehive shapes of wickiups, their frames of bent branches covered in brush and hide. Smoke curled from several cooking fires, and the sounds of life-children's laughter. The low chatter of women, the nicker of a horse rose to meet them. It was a sanctuary, a place of impossible peace. As they rode into the small settlement, people emerged from their homes. Their faces were curious, their dark eyes taking in the sight of the strange white woman in their midst. There was no hostility, only a watchful stillness. Children stopped their games to stare, their expressions a mixture of awe and caution. An older woman, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles and her long gray hair tied back in a simple knot, came forward to meet them. She moved with a straight-backed dignity, and when she looked at Naichi, her expression was one of both maternal love and a leader's respect. "Kosheda," Naichi said. Dismounting, he spoke to her in their language, his tone soft and deferential. His words were a river, flowing with a cadence Emma could not understand but a meaning she could feel. He spoke of the debt, of the rescue, and as he did, Kosheta's eyes moved to Emma. They were wise eyes, sharp and discerning, and they seemed to look past the color of her skin, past her strange clothes, and deep into the heart of her. Tazoo stepped forward and embraced his mother, and for the first time, Emma saw the young man's face relax into a boyish grin. Kosheta's hand rested on his head, a gesture of profound relief and tenderness. Then, to Emma's surprise, the older woman approached her. She took Emma's hands in her own. Her grip was firm, her palms calloused from a lifetime of work. "You are the one who returned my son to me," Kosheta said, her English slow but clear. "The breath he breathes is your gift. Our home is your home. You are not a prisoner here. You are honored." Tears pricked at Emma's eyes, hot and sudden. The simple, solemn gratitude in the woman's voice undid something deep inside her. At her own wedding, she had been an object, a prize. Here, in a place she should have feared, she was being welcomed as a benefactor, a giver of life. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that was entirely new to her. The life of the village was a communal dance, each person playing their part. The women were its heart, and they quietly, gently, drew Emma into their circle. At first, she was clumsy, her hands soft and unused to the tasks they performed with such effortless grace. A woman named Lilui, Tazoo's aunt, showed her how to grind corn on a flat stone, her movements patient and economical. Emma's arms ached. Her knees protested from kneeling. But the sweet, dusty smell of the cornmeal and the rhythmic scrape of stone on stone were deeply satisfying. She learned to fetch water from the creek, its cold, clear current a daily baptism that washed away the grime of the trail and the lingering scent of Hartley's perfumed hall. She helped mend torn leggings with an awl and sinew, her stitches crooked and large next to the neat, tiny ones of the other women. They would sometimes laugh, a soft, gentle sound, not at her incompetence, but with a kind of shared understanding. She was learning. She was trying. That was what mattered. In the evenings, as the sun set and painted the canyon walls in shades of rose and gold, the village would gather. An elder named Nahuel, his face as ancient and fissured as the rocks around them, would sometimes tell stories. He spoke of the creation of the world, of the spirits that lived in the wind and the water, of the long history of his people. He spoke of the coming of the white man, the new people, he called them, with their iron horses and their paper laws that tried to carve up the sky. "There are two worlds," he said one evening, his voice a dry rustle like leaves in the wind, his eyes fixed on the fire. "One world measures a man by the land he owns, by the gold in his pocket. The other measures him by the honor in his heart and the truth on his tongue. It is hard for two such worlds to share the same air." Emma felt the truth of his words resonate in her bones. She had been born into one world and had stumbled, half blind, into the other. And in this world, she felt a sense of belonging that the grandest house in Cedar Ridge could never offer. Here, family was not just a matter of blood, but of shared breath, of mutual obligation, of a debt of kindness that could never be fully repaid. Still, a shadow lingered in her heart. In the quiet moments before sleep, lying on a soft pile of furs inside Kosheta's wickiup, she would think of her parents. She pictured their panic, their shame. William Hartley would have painted a dark picture of her disappearance, a tale of a savage raid and a brutal abduction. He would never admit she had gone willingly. The guilt was a heavy stone, a constant ache for the pain she knew she had caused them. She had chosen her own freedom, but the price had been their peace of mind. The conflict tore at her, leaving her to wonder if any choice could ever be truly clean, truly right. Her perception of Naichi was shifting. Too, in the village, he was more than the stoic warrior who had pulled her from her wedding. He was a leader, a son, a brother. She saw him consult with the elders, his head bent respectfully to hear their counsel. She saw him playing with the children, a rare, gentle smile softening the hard lines of his face. He was responsible for these people, for their safety and their future. His rescue of her had not been a whim. It was an act born of a deep, unshakable code of honor, a duty to his family and his people. He treated her with a consistent, respectful distance, never imposing, never assuming. He had given her a horse, clothes, a place of safety, but most importantly, he had consistently given her a choice. About a week after her arrival, Kosheda sought her out by the creek where she was washing clothes. The older woman sat beside her on a sun-warmed rock. "You have a name," Kosheda said. "Emma, it is a good name for the world you came from." She paused, looking at the water flowing over the smooth stones. "But a person who begins a new life needs a new name for that life, a name that speaks of the path they are on now." She looked at Emma, her dark eyes kind. "We will call you Hetsan. It means the beginning. For you are the beginning of a new story for yourself, and for us, you are the beginning of a debt repaid." Hetsan, the beginning. The name settled over Emma like a warm blanket. It wasn't a denial of who she had been, but an acknowledgement of who she was becoming. It was a gift, a formal acceptance into the heart of this hidden community. She was no longer just Emma Sullivan, the runaway bride. She was Hetsan, a woman with a place, a name given in honor. That very evening, the fragile peace of the valley was broken. A scout, a young man who had been gone for 2 days, rode into the village, his horse lathered and spent. He slid from its back and went directly to Naichi, speaking in urgent, low tones. A grim silence fell over the gathered people. The children stopped their play. The women paused in their work. Everyone watched Naichi. His face hardened into a mask of stone as he listened. When the scout had finished, Naichi stood before his people. "Hartley comes," he said, his voice clear and cold, carrying to every corner of the settlement. "He does not come alone. He has hired guns, men who sell their loyalty for silver, and he has soldiers with him. From the fort, he has told them we raided his home, that we stole his wife. They ride under the law of the white man to bring back what he has lost." A ripple of fear went through the crowd. This was not just a posse of angry ranchers. This was the United States Army. This was war. Emma felt the blood drain from her face. This was her fault. Her choice, her desperate run for freedom, had brought this upon them. These people, who had shown her nothing but kindness, who had taken her in and given her a name, were now in mortal danger because of her. The stone of guilt in her heart grew until it threatened to choke her. Naichi's eyes found hers across the firelit space. There was no blame in his gaze, only a grim acceptance of the facts. He had known this was a possibility. He had chosen to act anyway, to follow his law of honor. Now, he would face the consequences. The men began to move, checking their rifles, gathering their bows and arrows. The women started packing food and water, their faces tight with worry, preparing for a fight or a flight. The idyllic peace of the valley had been a fleeting dream. The two worlds Nawel had spoken of were about to collide, and she, Emma, Hetsan, was standing at the heart of the storm. Instead of preparing for battle, Naichi sent a single rider under a banner of truce. The message was simple: a proposal to meet, to speak before the guns did. He offered a neutral place, a high, flat-topped mesa known to all as Table Rock, a natural altar that stood between the territory of his people and the lands the ranchers were claiming. It was a place where the wind spoke with a single voice and a man's words could be weighed without echo. The news that Hartley had agreed to the parley sent a strange, tense stillness through the hidden valley. It was a reprieve, but everyone knew it was only a postponement of the inevitable. Emma felt the eyes of the village on her. She was the cause of this, the human tinder that threatened to set the whole world ablaze. The weight of it was a physical thing, pressing down on her shoulders, tightening her chest. When Naichi announced he would go to the meeting at sunrise with Tazu and 2 other warriors, Emma stepped forward from the firelight. "I will go with you," she said. Her voice did not tremble. In the past week, a new kind of steel had been forged inside her. Kosheda immediately placed a protective hand on her arm. "No. Hetsane, it is too dangerous. He is a man with a bitter heart." "That is why I must go," Emma replied, looking not at Kosheda but at Naichi. "This is about me. He will speak of me as if I'm a stolen horse or a sack of grain. I will not have others speak for my life. I will speak for myself." A murmur went through the gathered people. It was a bold thing for a woman to say, let alone a white woman in her position, but Naichi saw the unwavering resolve in her eyes. He had seen it the night she walked away from her own wedding feast. He had seen it when she cut away her dress and put on the deerskin. He recognized it for what it was, the quiet, unshakable strength of a spirit that refused to be broken. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "You will speak," he said. It was not a concession. It was an acknowledgement of her right. The sky was the color of a fresh wound as they rode out of the hidden valley the next morning. The air was cold and thin, carrying the scent of dust and the promise of a long, hot day. The rising sun cast their long shadows ahead of them, dark figures moving toward a confrontation written in blood-red light. Table Rock loomed against the horizon, a stark silhouette. It felt like a courthouse built by God, waiting for a judgment. They were the first to arrive, taking up a position on the eastern edge of the mesa. The rock was flat and windswept, scoured clean by an eternity of exposure. From here, one could see for 50 miles in every direction, a panorama of raw, unforgiving land. There was nowhere to hide. Within the hour, they saw the dust cloud approaching from the west. A party of 5 riders emerged from the haze. Emma's heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. She recognized William Hartley's powerful frame instantly. Beside him, looking deeply uncomfortable, was Sheriff Morrison. Flanking them were 2 of Hartley's ranch hands, their faces grim and set. But it was the 5th rider that made a cold knot of dread form in Emma's stomach. He wore the blue uniform of the United States Cavalry, a young lieutenant with a rigid posture and an air of detached authority. The law was no longer a local affair. They reined in their horses 20 yards away. The 5 men dismounted, their movements stiff with tension, Hartley's eyes, small and hard in his fleshy face, fixed on Emma. There was no flicker of concern or relief, only a cold, possessive fury. He looked at her deerskin tunic and leggings as if she had personally spat in his face. "So," Hartley's voice boomed, shattering the high desert silence, "the runaway bride shows herself dressed like a savage. Have you lost your mind, woman?" Before Emma could answer, Naichi took a single step forward. "She is here as an honored guest of my people, Hartley. We have come to talk, not to trade insults." Honored guest Hartley let out a harsh, barking laugh. "You call theft and abduction an honor? I have a marriage license, signed and witnessed, that says she is my wife. I have the law on my side." He jabbed a thumb toward the young lieutenant, who stepped forward. "I am Lieutenant Evans," the officer said, his voice clipped and official. "I'm here at Mr. Hartley's request to ensure the return of his legal spouse and to arrest those responsible for her abduction. My orders are clear. You are in violation of territorial law." Sheriff Morrison shifted his weight, his gaze troubled. "Now, Lieutenant, Naichi, let's all just hold on. There's been a misunderstanding. I'm sure we can resolve this without bloodshed. Emma," he said, his voice softening as he addressed her directly for the first time. "Are you all right? Did they harm you?" It was her moment. The men stood poised, a tableau of competing laws and bristling pride. The law of the marriage license, the law of the army, the law of keeping the peace, and the law of an ancient debt. She was the fulcrum on which it all turned. She took a breath, feeling the freedom of her unconstricted lungs, and stepped forward, out from behind the line of Nietzsche's warriors. "I am fine, Sheriff," she said, her voice clear and steady. It carried surprisingly well in the thin air. "I was not harmed. I was not abducted." Hartley's face went purple. "What nonsense is this? They stormed my home with rifles." "They came to offer me a choice," Emma continued, her eyes locking with Hartley's. "And I made one. I am not here because I was taken. Mr. Hartley, I am here because I left." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the whisper of the wind across the rock. The lieutenant looked confused, his by-the-book certainty faltering. Sheriff Morrison's expression was one of dawning, grim understanding. Hartley looked as if she had struck him. "You left," he repeated, his voice dangerously low. "You left your husband, your home for this filth." "I left a contract that was signed for me," Emma said, the words coming to her with a clarity she had never known. "I left a house that was never to be my home. I left a man who looked at me as he would a new piece of furniture." She stood straighter, feeling a power she never knew she possessed. "You speak of laws, Mr. Hartley, Lieutenant. You speak of paper and ink. But there is a law that comes before all of that. I am not a piece of property. I am not an object to be bought and sold and owned. I belong to myself." "This is preposterous," Lieutenant Evans sputtered, regaining his composure. "Ma'am, with all due respect, your personal feelings do not negate a legal marriage." "My personal feelings are all I have," Emma shot back. "They are the only thing that truly belongs to me. And they tell me that a marriage built on a business transaction is no marriage at all. It is a prison." William Hartley took a menacing step forward, his hand clenching into a fist. "You will come back with me now. Emma, this foolishness is over. We will forget this ever happened." "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it had the finality of a closing door. "I will not." Hartley's face contorted with a rage that stripped away his thin veneer of civilization, revealing the raw, ugly tyrant beneath. He saw he had lost. He had lost control. He had been publicly humiliated. He spun on the lieutenant. "Are you going to enforce the law or not? Soldier," he snarled. "She is with them. She admits it. It's your duty to retrieve her." The lieutenant was trapped. His orders were to retrieve an abducted woman. But the woman in question was standing before him, sane and articulate, claiming she had not been abducted at all. He looked from Emma's determined face to Nietzsche's stony resolve. He saw the warriors, silent and ready. He was a young officer, and this was not a situation his training had prepared him for. Hartley, seeing the officer's hesitation, took matters into his own hands. He pointed a thick finger at Nietzsche. "I will not be made a fool of," he bellowed, his voice echoing across the empty land. "You have 24 hours. One day. Have her back in Cedar Ridge by sunrise tomorrow. If she is not there, we will come and get her, and we will not come to talk. The army will ride with me, and we will burn you out of whatever hole you're hiding in. This is not a request. It is a promise." With that, he turned, stomped back to his horse, and mounted. His two ranch hands followed, casting nervous glances back at the silent Apache warriors. Lieutenant Evans hesitated for a moment, his expression a mixture of frustration and duty, before he too turned and mounted. Sheriff Morrison was the last to leave. He paused, his eyes meeting Emma's. In them, she saw a deep and profound sorrow. He had spent his life trying to balance the two worlds, trying to keep the peace. He knew, as she now knew, that the balance had just been irrevocably broken. Without a word, he tipped his hat, a gesture of weary resignation, and rode away. They stood on the rock, the 4 Apache warriors and the woman in deerskin, and watched the dust of the 5 riders recede into the vast, indifferent landscape. The sun was higher now, its heat beating down on the mesa. The clock had started ticking. The ride back to the valley was heavy with a silence that was deeper and more terrible than before. The choice was no longer a theoretical thing. It had a deadline. It had a price. And that price would be paid in blood. Back in the village, the news spread without a word being spoken. The people saw it in the faces of their leader and the woman he had brought among them. Emma went to the creek, needing the sound of the water, the feel of the solid earth beneath her feet, the faces of the children she had come to know, the kindness of Kosheda and Lilui, the wisdom of Nahuel. It all rose before her. They would die. They would die for her. She could stop it. She could surrender herself. She could walk back into the cage, and these people would be safe. The thought was a physical sickness, a foul taste in her mouth. To return to Hartley now would be a fate worse than any death she could imagine. But to stay, to condemn this entire community for her own freedom. That evening, she found Naiichi sitting alone, watching the last of the light fade from the canyon rim. He did not look at her as she approached, but he knew she was there. "I should go back," she said, the words feeling like stones in her throat. "It is the only way to keep your people safe." He was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the darkening sky. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and thoughtful. "If you go back to him," he said, "you will stop the soldiers from riding tomorrow. You will save lives. That is true." He turned his head then, and his dark eyes met hers. They were filled with a gravity that seemed to hold the weight of all his people's history. "But the life you save for them will be paid for with your own. And a man who believes a wife is something he can buy will never understand a woman who believes she is free. He does not want you. Het sane. He wants what he paid for. Do not mistake the two." He stood and walked away, leaving her alone with his words and the terrible, impossible choice. The 24 hours had begun. The hours that followed the meeting on Table Rock were the longest of Emma's life. A heavy, suffocating blanket of dread settled over the hidden valley. The men moved with a grim purpose, sharpening blades, checking the mechanisms of their old rifles, and talking in low, serious tones. The women worked just as hard, packing what little they could, preparing food that could be eaten on the move, their faces etched with a fear they tried to hide from their children. Every normal sound a laugh. A shout felt jarring, an echo from a world that no longer existed. This was a community holding its breath, waiting for the axe to fall. Emma tried to help, to make herself useful, but her hands felt clumsy and her mind was a whirlwind of guilt. She saw the faces around her, the quiet dignity of Kushida, the youthful resolve of Tazu, the worried eyes of the mothers, and saw them as her victims. Her one act of defiance, her desperate grasp for freedom, was going to be paid for with their lives. The choice Naichi's words had left her with was no choice at all. How could her own spirit be worth more than the life of a single child in this village? How could her desire to be free justify the destruction of this entire community? She could not eat. The corn cake Lily pressed into her hand felt like ash in her mouth. She could not sit still. The quiet hum of the village preparing for war was a constant accusation. Finally, as the sun began its slow descent, casting long, mournful shadows across the valley floor, she saw Naichi emerge from a council with the elders. His face was a mask of grim responsibility. He looked tired, weighed down by the burden of his leadership. Their eyes met across the central fire, and he seemed to see the frantic, tearing conflict that was consuming her. He walked toward her, his moccasins making no sound on the packed earth. "There is a place," he said, his voice low, cutting through the ambient noise of preparation. "A high place, where a person can see what is real and what is shadow. Come." It was not a command, but an invitation she was too weary to refuse. He led her to 2 horses. Already saddled, he said nothing more as they rode out of the village, following a narrow, winding trail that climbed the steep walls of the canyon. The path was treacherous, a goat track clinging to the side of the mountain, but the horses were steady, and Naichi rode with a calm assurance that soothed some of the frantic terror in her heart. As they climbed, the valley fell away below them, the wickiups shrinking, the fires becoming tiny points of light in the growing dusk. The air grew thinner, cooler. The noise and fear of the preparations faded, replaced by the vast, elemental silence of the high country, broken only by the wind and the soft tread of their horses. They emerged onto a narrow, wind-swept promontory, a finger of rock that pointed out into an ocean of sky. The sun had just slipped below the distant horizon, leaving the western sky bruised with violent shades of purple and orange and red. The world below was a sea of deepening shadows, but up here, they were still bathed in the day's last, spectacular light. They dismounted and walked to the edge. The wind tugged at Emma's hair, pulling it free from the simple ties she had used. It felt clean, wild. For the first time all day, she felt she could almost breathe. "From here," Nietzsche said, his gaze on the horizon, "a man can see how small he is, how small his troubles are against the sky." "My troubles are not small," Emma said, the words catching in her throat. "They are going to bring an army to your home. Your people will suffer because of me." "My people have always suffered," he replied, his voice devoid of self-pity. It was a simple statement of fact. We suffer because our world and the white man's world are like two wolves fighting over the same kill. This fight was coming. Hetsane, with you or without you, you were not the cause. You were just the spark that lit the fire a little sooner. He turned to look at her, his face illuminated by the dying light. "I am the one who brought the spark into our home. I chose to honor my brother's debt. My choice, not yours." His words were a balm, easing a fraction of the crushing weight on her soul. He was taking his share of the responsibility, acknowledging his own agency. He was not treating her as a helpless piece of baggage that had brought trouble, but as an equal participant in a series of choices that had led them to this precipice. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the colors in the sky deepen and then fade to indigo. The first stars began to prick the darkness, cold and impossibly bright in the clear, thin air. "I used to dream of having a school," Emma said softly, the confession surprising even herself. "A small one, for the children on the ranches who were too far from town. I wanted to teach them to read, to see the world in books. I wanted to build something. Something that was mine." She looked down at her hands. "My parents thought it was a foolish dream. A woman's place was to be a wife, to manage a home, to be useful to a man. When Mr. Hartley offered for me, they saw it as the end of my foolishness and the beginning of my real life." Nietzsche listened, his attention a quiet, palpable thing. "It was a good dream," he said when she had finished. "To give knowledge is to give power." He looked out at the vast, star-filled darkness. "I did not dream of being a leader. My older brother was meant for that. He was strong and wise. But he died, in a raid by soldiers 5 winters ago. My father followed him to the spirit world a season later. The responsibility fell to me. It is a heavy blanket, Hetsan. Some days, it is warm. Most days, it is suffocating." In his quiet admission, Emma heard an echo of her own life. Both of them had been trapped by responsibility, their own dreams and desires secondary to the duties placed upon them. He, by the traditions of his people and the tragedy of loss. She, by the expectations of her family and the rigid rules of her world. They were from 2 different universes, yet they stood on this cliff edge, bound by the same invisible chains. She felt a profound and aching connection to this quiet, stoic man, a kinship that went deeper than words. He had seen her, truly seen her, from the very beginning. He had looked past the white dress and the frightened bride, and seen the person gasping for air inside. The enormity of what he had risked, what his people were risking, washed over her again. But this time it was tempered with a question that rose from the deepest part of her. It was a question born of a lifetime of feeling plain, of being practical Emma Sullivan, the rancher's daughter. Not a woman of beauty or great import, a woman to be settled for, not fought for. She turned to him, her voice barely a whisper against the wind, The marriage to Hartley had been a legal fiction, an unfulfilled contract she'd fled. She was as untouched as the day she was born, yet she felt the world saw her as a sullied, runaway wife. "Why me?" she asked, the question fragile and full of a lifetime of doubt. "Why would you do all of this for me?" Naichi was silent for a moment. He looked at her, and his eyes, which so often held the vast, lonely distance of the landscape, were now focused and incredibly close. He slowly raised his hand, not to touch her face, but to press his palm flat against his own chest, over his heart. "'Cause you're pure as the prairie," he said, his voice low and rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "When I saw you on that mountain with my brother, your hands gentle on his broken leg, your eyes holding no fear, only kindness, I saw your spirit. It is not about the things men say a woman should be. It is not about a body. It is about the heart." He looked out at the vast, dark plains below, now silvered by the rising moon. "Your heart is as clear and strong as the dawn on the prairie. That is rare. That is worth fighting for." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow, shattering the last of her defenses. He was not talking about innocence in the way her world defined it, as something to be guarded and sold to the highest bidder. He was talking about an intrinsic quality of her soul, a purity of intent and kindness that he had recognized and valued above all else. He had seen the very best part of her, the part she herself had almost forgotten existed. Tears she hadn't realized she was holding back began to trace hot paths down her cold cheeks. He saw them, but made no move to wipe them away, granting her the dignity of her own tears. He had answered her question. Now, it was her turn to speak a truth. The choice was no longer about escaping a prison or saving a village. It had become something more profound. It was about choosing a life, a person, a future, however uncertain. "The path you walk," she said, her voice gaining strength, "it is a hard one. It may lead to nothing but dust and sorrow." "As you said," she met his gaze, her own eyes clear and unwavering in the moonlight. "But it is a path of honor. It is a path of truth." She took a small step closer to him, the space between them suddenly charged with a new and powerful current. "I am no longer running away from anything. Naichi, I am walking towards something. I choose this path. I choose you." The last of his reserve seemed to fall away. The leader, the warrior, was gone, and in his place was only the man. He reached out and took her hand. His touch was not possessive or demanding, but a simple, warm, grounding connection. His calloused fingers laced through hers, a silent, binding promise. They stood there for a long time, hand in hand on the edge of the world, under a canopy of 1,000,000 stars. The wind howled around them, but in their small circle of shared warmth, there was a profound stillness. They had spoken, they had chosen. The commitment was made, not with the legal papers and hollow vows of her world, but with honest words and a shared understanding. Here, in the great silent cathedral of the wilderness, the dawn was coming. It would bring Hartley, and the soldiers, and the terrible certainty of violence. But for the first time, Emma was not afraid. She would face the morning not as a runaway bride or a guilty burden, but as a woman who knew her own worth, standing beside a man who had shown it to her. They had chosen each other. Forever. The descent from the high promontory was a journey back into a world of consequence. The breathless clarity of the starlit peak, where promises had been made with the simple weight of truth, gave way to the tense, earthbound reality of the village below. Emma and Naichi rode in a shared silence, but it was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the quiet of two people who had looked over the edge of the world together and had not flinched. The choice was made. The die was cast. Now, they had only to face the dawn. They did not wait in their hidden valley to be trapped. Naichi was a leader, not a martyr, and he would choose his own ground for this fight. before the first hint of gray had touched the eastern sky. The village was empty. The women, children, and elders, led by Kushida and a handful of warriors, moved deeper into the labyrinth of canyons, toward a place of greater safety. The remaining men, a small force of perhaps 20, followed Naichi. Emma rode with them. No one questioned her presence. She was no longer a guest or a refugee. She was Hetsan, and this was her fight as much as theirs. Naichi led them to a narrow, jagged scar in the earth known as Crow's Canyon. It was a natural bottleneck, its sheer rock walls rising hundreds of feet on either side, the passage between them barely wide enough for 2 horses to ride abreast. The canyon floor was a bed of sand and rock, littered with ancient boulders that provided natural cover. It was a place designed for ambush, a death trap for any army foolish enough to enter it. Here, a handful of determined men could hold off 100. The Apache warriors moved with a silent, fluid grace, melting into the landscape. They took up positions high in the rocks, behind ledges, in crevices that were all but invisible from below. They were patient, their stillness a part of the rock itself. Naichi positioned Emma behind a large fall of shale near the mouth of the canyon, a place of relative safety but with a clear view of the entrance. He gave her a rifle. "I know you can shoot," he said simply. He had seen the way she handled her own horse, the quiet competence that was the mark of a rancher's daughter. "Do not be the first to fire, but if the fighting starts, do not hesitate to defend the life you have chosen." He squeezed her shoulder, a brief, firm touch, and then he was gone, vanishing into the rocks above her. Emma was left alone with the rifle, the cold morning air, and the frantic, drumming beat of her own heart. The fear was back, a cold, metallic taste in her mouth, but the debilitating panic was gone. In its place was a hard, clear resolve. She had made her choice on the mountain. She would not betray it now. They did not have to wait long. First came the sound, a low, distant rumble that vibrated through the soles of her feet. Then, the dust cloud, a dirty brown plume rising against the pristine, rose-tinted sky of the new day. Finally, the riders emerged, a dark, menacing line of them. At the head of the column, just as she had seen him on Table Rock, was William Hartley. He rode a big, black stallion, his bulk seeming to dominate the landscape. Beside him, in their crisp blue uniforms, were Lieutenant Evans and a dozen cavalrymen. Behind them came the hired guns, a motley collection of hard-faced men. And bringing up the rear, looking more like a prisoner than a lawman, was Sheriff Morrison. The column halted at the mouth of the canyon. They saw the tracks leading in, but the passage itself was silent, still, seemingly empty. It was an obvious trap, and Lieutenant Evans looked uneasy, his military training warring with Hartley's impatient blustering. "They're in there," Hartley's voice boomed, echoing off the rock walls. "Hiding like the rats they are. Go in and flush them out." "Lieutenant, this is hazardous terrain. Mr. Hartley," the lieutenant countered, his voice tight. "My men would be at a severe disadvantage. We should secure the entrance and wait them out." "Wait," Hartley roared. "I'm not waiting. That woman is in there, my wife. I want her back." Emma watched them, her hand tight on the stock of the rifle. She saw the two sides, poised on the brink of a massacre. She saw the soldiers, boys mostly, who had no stake in this fight beyond their orders. She saw Naichi's warriors, ready to die to defend their honor and their home. And she saw herself, the single human reason for all of it. A wave of profound, soul-shaking clarity washed over her. This was not Naichi's fight to finish. It was hers. Before she fully understood what she was doing, she laid the rifle on the rock. She took a deep breath, and she stood up. She walked out from behind the shale, into the open, sunlit space at the mouth of the canyon. A single small figure in deerskin, standing between two armies. A collective gasp went up from Hartley's men. The soldiers stared, their rifles held uncertainly. Sheriff Morrison's head jerked up, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. "Stop!" Emma's voice, clear and strong, rang out in the sudden, ringing silence. "There is no need for this. No one else has to be hurt." For a moment, it seemed to work. The sheer, unexpected audacity of her act had stunned them all into stillness. But then William Hartley's face contorted, his initial shock curdling into a monstrous, possessive rage. He saw not a peacemaker, but the ultimate symbol of his public humiliation, standing there defiantly, dressed in the clothes of his enemy. She was not his frightened bride. She was his traitor. "You!" he bellowed, his voice cracking with fury. He raised his own rifle, the one he carried in a scabbard on his saddle, and aimed it directly at her heart. "You treacherous thing, you chose them over me." High in the rocks, a single Apache rifle cracked. It was not Naichi. It was Tazu, seeing the woman who had saved his life about to be shot down. The shot was fired not to kill, but to warn. It kicked up a puff of dust a foot from Hartley's horse. It was all the spark the powder keg needed. The hired guns, spooked and trigger-happy, opened fire into the rocks. The canyon erupted in a deafening, chaotic roar of gunfire. Rifles flashed from the hidden crevices in the walls. A cavalryman cried out and fell from his saddle. The narrow space became a maelstrom of ricocheting lead, panicked shouts, and the terrified screaming of horses. But through it all, Emma's world narrowed to a single point: William Hartley. He was oblivious to the battle raging around him. His entire being, his entire wounded pride and furious ego, was focused on her. He ignored the bullets whining past his head. He calmly, deliberately, took aim. Emma did not move. She did not scream or try to run. The time for running was over. She stood her ground, her back straight, and met his gaze across the 70 yards of sun-drenched, blood-soaked dust. She saw the naked hatred in his eyes, the final, ugly truth of the man she was supposed to call husband. He was not just trying to kill her. He was trying to erase his shame, to put a bullet through the living symbol of his failure. Time seemed to stretch, to slow down. She saw his finger tighten on the trigger. And then, a different sound. Not the sharp crack of a rifle, but the deeper, heavier boom of a Colt revolver, fired from much closer. William Hartley's body jerked as if struck by a giant, invisible hand. A look of profound, almost comical surprise spread across his face. The rifle discharged into the sky as he fell, a slow, clumsy toppling from his horse. He hit the ground with a heavy, final thud, a cloud of red dust rising around him. The fighting faltered. All eyes turned to the source of the shot. Sheriff Morrison sat on his horse, his smoking pistol held steady in his hand. His face was a grim, gray mask of resolve. The battle for his conscience was over. "There's the law," he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the sudden, shocked silence. "And then there's justice." He looked down at the body of the man who had owned their town, the man whose word had been the law. "Today, I'm choosing justice." The fight was over. The hired guns, their employer dead, had no more reason to risk their lives. They began to back away, melting into the landscape. Lieutenant Evans, his face pale and his authority shattered, looked at Hartley's body, then at the silent, watchful rocks. He had come to retrieve a kidnapped wife. He had found a civil war, and now its cause was a legal matter far beyond his pay grade. He gave a sharp order, and his remaining soldiers collected their wounded and began a swift, disciplined retreat. The silence that descended on Crow's Canyon was heavier than any sound had been. The Apache warriors emerged slowly from the rocks, their faces grim. The brief, brutal fight had cost them. 2 of their own lay still. Emma walked forward on legs that felt like they were made of wood. She walked past the dead and the dying, her gaze fixed on the body of William Hartley. He lay sprawled in the dust, his eyes open and staring at the vast, indifferent blue sky. He no longer looked powerful. He just looked like a man, small and broken. She stood over him for a long moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she reached for the diamond ring on her left hand. It was tight, and she had to twist it, the metal biting into her skin one last time. It finally came free. She did not throw it away. She did not keep it. She bent down and placed the heavy, glittering ring on the still chest of his coat. It was a final transaction. The debt was paid. The contract was closed. She straightened up and turned away, leaving the body, the ring, and the entire world they represented behind her in the red dust. Nietzsche was there. He put a hand on her arm, his touch steadying, and led her away from the carnage, back toward the deep shadows of the canyon. The war for her freedom was over. The cost had been terrible, but as she walked away, the sun warm on her face, she knew, with a certainty that settled into the very marrow of her bones, that she would never be in a cage again. The aftermath of the battle in Crow's Canyon was not victory. It was a somber reckoning. They buried their dead in shallow, rocky graves, the ancient Apache prayers for the journey of the spirit, a quiet murmur against the canyon walls. There was no triumph in their faces, only a profound, weary sorrow. The cost of standing their ground had been 2 lives, and the future they had won was that of the hunted. There was no question of returning to their hidden valley. Word of the confrontation would spread like wildfire. Sheriff Morrison had made his choice, but he was only one man. The full weight of the territory's law, fueled by the outrage over a dead land baron and 2 dead soldiers, would come down upon them. Their home was no longer a sanctuary. It was a trap. Their world had shrunk to what they could carry on their horses. They were a people in exile, and their only option was to flee south, to cross a border that meant little to the land but everything to the men who drew lines on maps. The journey to Mexico was a silent, grim affair. The exhilaration of flight, the raw thrill of freedom Emma had felt on that first night, was gone, replaced by the hard, grinding reality of survival. They traveled by night and hid by day, their path a winding, desperate thread through a harsh and unforgiving landscape. Emma rode not as a passenger or a liability, but as one of them. She took her turn at watch, her eyes scanning the horizon for the dust cloud that would signal their pursuers. She learned to read the subtle signs of the trail, to understand the language of a broken twig or a displaced stone. The soft-handed daughter of a rancher was a ghost, a memory. In her place was Hetsen, a woman whose hands were becoming calloused, whose gaze was steady, and whose heart, though heavy with loss, was no longer afraid. After weeks of travel that blurred into a single, aching memory of exhaustion and dust, the land began to change. The red rock and sparse juniper of their home country gave way to a landscape of even grander and more terrifying scale. The mountains were higher, the canyons deeper. They had reached the Barranca del Cobre, the Copper Canyon of Mexico. Here, in a place so vast and remote that the laws of distant governments felt like whispers, they found a place to rest. It was not a village like their own, but a small, scattered community of Tarahumara people and a few Mexican families who lived in quiet, wary coexistence. They were welcomed not with open arms, but with a cautious, watchful curiosity. Nietzsche had kin here, a distant aunt named Dahlia, a woman whose wisdom was as deep and fissured as the canyons she called home. Dahlia's presence was their passport, their letter of introduction. She vouched for them and the community, while keeping its distance, allowed them to stay. Winter settled into the canyon, a time of quiet and cold. The world seemed to hold its breath, and for the first time in months, they were not running. For Emma, it was a time of profound and quiet transformation. The relentless forward motion of their flight had been replaced by the slow, circular rhythms of a stationary life. She was no longer just surviving. She was learning to live. Under Dahlia's patient tutelage, she delved deeper into the life she had chosen. Her days were filled with the work of women's hands. She learned the intricate patterns of weaving, the bright threads telling stories of the earth and sky. She learned which plants gave healing and which gave sustenance. Her knowledge of the land growing root by root, her tongue, which had stumbled over the Apache words, began to find their music, their cadence. She could sit by the fire with the other women, understanding their low-spoken jokes, their shared worries, their quiet strength. Her relationship with Naichi deepened in the stillness of that winter. Their bond, forged in the crucible of flight and battle, was now tempered in the quiet forge of daily life. Love, she was discovering, was not just a grand declaration on a mountain top. It was in the way he brought her a rare, sweet root he had found on a hunt. It was in the way she mended a tear in his tunic, her stitches now small and neat. It was in the shared silence as they watched the stars wheel across the immense, black sky. A silence that was no longer empty, but full of a deep, unspoken understanding. They were two solitary people who had found in each other a place to rest their hearts. Yet their life in the canyon was a precarious one. They were refugees, living on the sufferance of others. The political winds could shift, the fragile peace could be broken. The threat from the north, though distant, had not vanished. They were a people without a home, and the knowledge was a constant, low ache in the heart of their community. The first seed of a new hope came with a traveling trader, a wiry old Mexican who brought salt and news from the world beyond the canyon rim. He spoke of a place far to the east, in Texas, a ranch run by a white woman who had married a Comanche chief. He said they had found a way to live between the two worlds, that they had a piece of paper from the government that gave them title to their land, a place where their children, who had the blood of both peoples, could grow without fear. The story was probably just a rumor, a whisper on the wind, but it took root in Emma's mind. A place to build, not just to hide, a place to put down roots, to plant seeds, a place where they would not be defined as fugitives, but as a family. It was a fragile, improbable dream, but it was better than no dream at all. The idea of running again was exhausting, but running toward something that was a different thing entirely. It was a journey, not a flight. Before they could even consider such a journey, Emma knew there was something she needed to do. Her first wedding had been a public declaration of ownership, a legal contract she'd been forced into. The life she shared with Naichi was real, true, and bound by a promise made under the stars. But she wanted to honor it with a ritual, a ceremony that belonged to their community, to their world. She wanted a marriage that was a choice, not a transaction. She went to Naichi one evening as the full moon was rising, its silver light flooding the canyon. "I was married once, by the laws of my old life," she said, her voice quiet but sure. "It was a cage. I want to be married now, by the laws of this life, as a partner, not as property. I want to stand before your people and declare that my path is your path. I want to be your wife, Naichi, by choice." A slow, rare smile touched his lips, and it reached his eyes, crinkling their corners. He took her hand. "In my heart, Het-Sain, you have been my wife since the night you stood on the mountain and chose me. But our people will be glad to see our choice made into a promise." The ceremony was nothing like the stifling, ostentatious affair in Hartley's mansion. There was no priest, no suffocating corset, no legal documents. There was only the community, the fire, and the immense, silent witness of the moonlit sky. Kasheda and Dahlia had helped her prepare. They had made her a new tunic and leggings of the softest, whitest, brain-tanned deerskin. Lilui and the other women had spent weeks adorning it with intricate beadwork, patterns of the morning star, and the life-giving river, symbols of a new beginning. She was not a bride in a cage of silk, but a woman adorned in the artistry and love of her new family. They stood together in the center of the circle of firelight, Dahlia, her face serene and ancient in the flickering light. came forward. She held a single, long rope, braided from the black hairs of a horse's tail, strong and resilient. "A life is a single thread," Dahlia said, her voice a low chant. "Today, two threads are woven together. They do not disappear. They become something stronger, a new rope to carry the burdens of the future." She took Emma's left wrist and wrapped one end of the horsehair rope around it. Then she took Naichi's right wrist and wrapped the other end. She pulled the two ends together and tied them with a knot that was both simple and unbreakable. Their hands were bound, not in chains, but in a shared, willing tether. "You were two paths," Dahlia said, her eyes on their joined hands. "Now, you are one. You will walk it together. You will share its joys, and you will carry its sorrows. Let no person break this bond, which is made not by law, but by the choice of two hearts." Naichi turned to Emma, his hand warm and steady next to hers. He looked into her eyes, and in their dark depths, she saw not the fierce warrior or the stoic leader, but the man who had seen her spirit when no one else had. He spoke the ancient words of the Apache vow, a promise to protect, to provide, to honor. Then it was her turn. She looked at this man who had become her world, and she spoke not in the Apache tongue she was still learning, but in the language of her own heart. "I came to you with nothing but a broken promise and a torn dress," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You gave me a place to breathe. You gave me a name. You gave me a choice. I promised to walk this path with you, to be your partner, to build a home with my hands and my heart. I promised to honor your freedom, as you have honored mine. My life is bound to yours, not by force, but by love." A murmur of approval went through the gathered people. The two paths had become one. They were no longer simply a man and a woman who had found each other in a storm. They were husband and wife, their union blessed and witnessed by the people they now called family. They stood for a long time, their wrists bound together, feeling the quiet, powerful strength of the promise that flowed between them, as real and true as the moonlight that bathed the silent canyon. They had a long road ahead, toward a rumor and a fragile hope, but they would walk it together. The winter in Copper Canyon was a long, slow exhalation, a time for the wounds of the body and spirit to scar over. But spring arrived with a restless wind that whispered of other places, of thawing rivers and greening plains. It stirred the blood and awakened the deep, human yearning for a place to call home. The rumor the trader had brought, the story of the Texas ranch where two worlds had learned to live as one, was no longer just a whisper. It had become a beacon, a fragile but persistent point of light in the vast darkness of their uncertainty. The decision to leave was not made lightly. For weeks, the elders sat in council with Naichi, their weathered faces serious in the firelight. Here in the deep canyons of Mexico, they had a measure of safety. It was a borrowed peace, a life lived in the shadow of another's home, but it was peace nonetheless. To leave was to embrace the unknown once more, to put themselves at the mercy of the trail, of strangers, of the ever-present threat from the north. Emma sat with the women on the edge of these councils. Listening, she did not speak, for it was not her place, but she understood the weight of the choice. She watched Naichi, saw the burden of his people's future in the set of his jaw, in the thoughtful way he listened to every opinion. He was no longer the lone warrior who had acted on a debt of honor. He was a husband and a leader, weighing the survival of his family against the hope for a life of dignity. It was Koshida who finally spoke the words that tipped the balance. Her voice, usually so gentle, held the firm conviction of a matriarch. "We have been hiding," she said, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the men. "Our children are safe, but they are not free. They are growing up in a borrowed house, learning the language of another's land. A life without a future is not a life. It is a long waiting for the end. This place in Texas, it may be a lie. The journey will be hard, but it is a journey toward a hope. Hiding is a journey toward dust. I say we walk toward the hope." Her words settled the matter. The council was over. They would go. The preparations began, but they were different from the frantic, fearful packing that had preceded their flight from the hidden valley. This was an organized, hopeful endeavor. It was the gathering of a people preparing not for war, but for a pilgrimage. They mended clothes, repaired saddles, and ground corn into meal for the long journey. There was a current of excitement, of purpose, that ran through the small community, a shared sense of embarking on a great and meaningful adventure. During those final weeks, Emma found herself looking back, not with regret, but with a kind of quiet awe at the impossible distance she had traveled. She would sometimes touch the soft, beaded deerskin of her wedding tunic and remember the stiff, suffocating satin of the gown she had been married in. The woman who had worn that dress, with her carefully pinned hair and her shallow breaths, felt like a distant ancestor, a figure from a storybook. She had been a girl defined by the choices of others, her parents, her society, her husband-to-be. She had been chosen. Now, she was the one who chose. She chose to wake each morning beside Naichi, their hands finding each other in the pre-dawn chill. She chose to spend her days working alongside Kosheda and Lilui, her hands now competent and strong. She chose the hard, simple truths of this life over the soft, suffocating lies of the one she had left behind. She was Hetsain, the beginning, and she was finally, truly, the author of her own story. She thought, sometimes, of Sheriff Morrison. She pictured him back in Cedar Ridge, a lonely figure of conscience in a town built on the hard rock of expediency. Had his act of justice cost him his badge, his freedom? She would likely never know. He was a ghost from her past, a man caught between two worlds who, for one crucial, violent moment, had chosen to stand in hers. She sent a silent prayer for him on the wind, a wish for a peace she hoped he had found. She thought of her parents, too. The ache of guilt had not vanished, but it had changed. It was no longer a sharp, tearing pain, but a dull, constant sorrow, the price of her own life. She hoped that somehow word had reached them that she was alive, that she had not been a victim but a participant in her own destiny. Perhaps they would never understand, let alone forgive. But she had made her peace with that. She could not live their life for them. She could only live her own. The day of their departure arrived, clear and bright. They said their farewells to Dahlia and the people of the canyon, a bittersweet parting full of embraces and solemn promises to remember. They were a small band, no more than 30 souls, as they rode out of the sanctuary that had sheltered them through the winter. They were not an army, nor a raiding party. They were a family, on the move. As they rode north, back toward the hazy, dangerous line of the border, Emma felt no fear. She felt only a quiet, steady resolve. They were moving toward an uncertain future, toward a rumor that might be nothing more than a desert mirage. They would face prejudice and hatred. The world was still full of men like William Hartley, men who believed that power and ownership were the only laws that mattered, but they would face it together. They traveled for many weeks, a slow, careful migration across a vast and beautiful land. They became a familiar sight, a small band of Apache, led by a quiet, watchful chief and his white wife, who rode as easily and confidently as any of them. They were met with suspicion in the few border towns they passed, but Naichi's calm dignity and the group's obvious lack of hostile intent seemed to diffuse most trouble before it could begin. They were not looking for a fight. They were looking for a home. One evening, they made camp by a small, spring-fed creek that nourished a grove of ancient cottonwoods. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in the same brilliant, heartbreaking colors she had seen from the promontory on the night she had chosen her path. The journey was long, and they were still far from their destination. But here, in the quiet peace of the evening, Emma felt a profound sense of rightness, of being exactly where she was meant to be. Naichi came and sat beside her, and they watched the last of the light fade. Tazu was nearby, teaching a few of the younger children a game with stones, their quiet laughter a gentle music on the air. Kushida was humming a low, ancient song as she sorted herbs for the evening meal. This was their life, stripped down to its essentials: family, community, and the shared hope for a safe place to sleep. Emma rested her head on Naichi's shoulder, feeling the steady strength of him, the solid, reassuring presence that had been her anchor through the storm. She looked at the faces of the people around her people. The girl in the silk cage had dreamed of a small schoolhouse. The woman in deerskin now dreamed of something far grander. She dreamed of a home, a place where their children, the children they hoped to have, would grow up speaking 2 languages, understanding 2 sets of laws, the paper laws of her world and the heart laws of his. Children who would know that love was not about possession, but about partnership. Children who would be able to breathe, freely and deeply, in a world that had tried to suffocate both of their parents. The road ahead was a long, unmarked trail shimmering under the sun. The future was an unwritten story. There would be hardship, and there would be sorrow. But as she sat there, bound to the man she loved, not by a rope of horsehair, but by 1,000 invisible threads of shared experience and mutual respect, she was not afraid of the unknown. She was ready for it. They had looked into the abyss, and they had chosen to build a bridge across it. "We chose each other," she whispered, the words a quiet renewal of the vow she had made under the stars. Naichi put his arm around her, pulling her close. "Forever," he replied, his voice a low, certain promise against the vast, gathering darkness of the prairie. They would face the morning, and every morning after that, together. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.